Good day, I'm Vincent Saxtetter, and this is the After the Age of Fire channel. This is episode 17, titled We Will Never Build Enough Solar, dated November 15th, 2025. What's enough solar? It's enough to supply all the 46,000 calories per person per day that we consume today. Um, it, that's that's going beyond providing all our electricity. We only use about a third of that, of the 46,000 calories is electricity. The rest is for other energy use. Um, this is part of a four-part sequence about wind, solar, and nuclear, all with the same result: we won't build enough. Now, just to remind you, what is this channel about? This is a kind of a prepping channel, but it's not your average prepping channel. What this channel does, or is doing, is I'm reviewing where we've been the last 250 years, doubling our consumption of energy and just about everything every 22 years or so for 250 years. And then where we are now, sometime around now, give or take 20 years, we're coming to the end of those doublings, and what will come next and how to prepare for that. Certainly, we live in extraordinary times. This doubling has been really extraordinary, but we're coming to another period which will be different because we won't be doubling anymore, and will still be extraordinary, but in a different way. And the question is how to prepare for that, how to how to set things up so that maybe your life in the next 20, 30 years will still be a good life, and how to continue your family line, what behaviors are likely to continue your family line, if hopefully you're interested in that, and what will help them prosper instead of withering away in the new circumstances. How can we avoid this being the winter of our discontent, and actually prosper and thrive under different circumstances? So, but I'm starting with going over the energy that we consume today and whether we can get more of it or whether we can maintain the current energy consumption. And after we nail that down, then we'll get into to how to prosper and thrive in the coming decades and century or two. So this is not prepping for, I don't know, mass immigration from leaving the cities and and trying to figure out how to be already in the country with your homestead when the marauders show up from the cities, or any number of other scenarios. This is I'm not talking about short-term things that take a year or 3 years to happen. I'm talking about things that will be even more world-shaking than those scenarios, but will take a century or so, maybe 50 years, maybe 150 years. So in all of these, wind, solar, and nuclear, I'll argue that we will never supply more than a fraction of the 46,000 calories that we consume today from these sources, maybe 15,000 or 20,000. I'm not arguing against building more wind, solar, and nuclear. I'm just saying we'll never build enough. So I think we can save a little time by saying that solar in some ways is very similar to wind, which I went over in the last episode, and so I won't spend as much time on some of those issues. Like wind, solar has periods of oversupply if you build enough to supply the amount that you use on average per day, then you'll find that what actually happens is that during some hours or during some weeks, you'll get more energy than you need, and you won't be able to use it all. And in other hours and weeks, you won't get enough energy, and you'll have a few options. There are three options about what to do when there's not enough solar energy coming or not enough wind energy coming. Let me just talk about why there might not be enough. First of all, there's nighttime, of course, when you don't get any solar energy. So maybe that, depending on the season, it might last between 8 and 14, 15 hours without any energy. And then during the day, of course, there's a peak time, and then near sunset and sunrise, you get less. But then there are also overcast days and overcast weeks. And overcast, our eyes are designed to deal with very low light scenarios. And overcast can mean that that you get that's 1,000th of the sun's energy is arriving at the sun's surface. That'd be a rather overcast day, but often enough it's 100th. So that would just be kind of a gray day, 100th of the sun coming to their surface, which means that as far as getting energy from the sun, you're getting 1%, which is practically nothing. Okay, so if you have an overcast week, that effectively means that for a week you're not getting any solar energy, and then you begin to wonder. Well, there are three options. One is you just accept it. You turn off all your lights, and not only your lights. If you're using solar energy to supply all your energy needs, then you turn off everything that you would, you turn off your hospitals, you turn off your police stations, you turn off your highways, the roads going up and down, the people going up and down the highways. You turn off your telephones, you turn off your communication equipment. All of it's off. Okay, that's one option when solar, when you have an overcast week. Okay, another option is to have solar be kind of icing on the cake, where most of your energy is coming from a steady source, and there are really only four: coal, oil, gas, and nuclear that can supply energy in the quantities that we want steadily. Okay, and you have a steady source, and then when the sun is shining, you can turn off some of your coal, oil, gas, and nuclear, and get some sunshine. That's the second option. It really requires you to be getting well more than a half of your energy from steady sources, not from solar. And the third option is to build energy storage. It could be batteries, or it could be pumped hydro, where you store water high in the mountains, and then when you need some energy, you let it cascade down into a lake lower down the mountains. Either way, we have maybe around 20 minutes of energy storage right now in batteries and in pumped hydro, and imagining how to expand that to 12 hours even, that would be quite a stretch for us. So we are never in the foreseeable future going to get a week of energy storage, or even a few days of energy storage, to back up our solar panels or our wind. So you can build some batteries, but they'll never be enough. And if you rely on just solar and batteries, or just, for that matter, wind and batteries, or wind and solar and batteries, any combination, and you do without the coal, oil, gas, and nuclear, then you will have the blackouts where everything is off. And equally well, you'll have the times when energy is an oversupply, and you've filled up your batteries and you're still getting too much energy, and that's just wasted. So if you build enough solar to supply 46,000 calories per person per day, on average, you actually are not going to get 46,000 calories per day, because a lot of the energy that it does harvest will come during times when you don't need it and your batteries are full. So these are some similarities. between solar and wind, okay, but there are also some key differences, and I'll unpack those in the following, but I just want to mention briefly what some of them are. One is solar does not involve these huge machines, or structures. You don't have an 150-meter structure sticking in the air, and you don't have. It's not in any way similar to building, say, an apartment building or some crane or a ship. And that's different from wind. Wind has similarities to all those things. On the other hand, even though you're not building a big machine, you do have to cover a very large area with your solar panels in order to supply energy in the quantities that we desire. So that it's big in one way and not big in another way, and these are key differences. Another difference, of course, is that solar is a lot more high-tech than wind. And the fourth difference is that wind, you get good efficiencies from a windmill if you build these big 150-meter high windmills that cost $3.6 million a piece. Whereas with solar, you can put one on your calculator, you could carry one on your hat, or your backpack, wherever you like. You can put one on your an array on your roof. You can customize them, and individual people can buy them and use them for specific purposes. And that really makes a big difference. That it gives individual people a bit more agency. It's not as much agency as you might think, because these people are still relying on some huge network of high-tech companies and suppliers around the world, and you're essentially letting them set the terms of your life when you buy their solar panels, but still it's a different matter than building a wind turbine. So with that said, those are preliminaries. I want to talk about, before I talk about the price of solar, which is the main point of this episode, I want to talk about specifically what is it that I'm talking about. So I'm talking specifically about silicon-based solar panels, the black flat things that you might see on people's roofs, or that you might see on a calculator or on some personal device. There are other kinds of solar energy that I'm not discussing, and I'll tell you why. Okay, one of them is actually, this is probably the cheapest and most practical form of solar energy. It's the one that's designed specifically just to warm your house or warm your water. So you put something on your roof that will absorb heat, and it will warm up some water, and then you circulate the water through your house. Or you could even do it even more simply just by designing. This is expensive, of course. You design and build a house in a way that it tends to trap sunlight and keep it. So I'm not going to discuss that, because the energy that we spend for warming our houses is a fraction of our total consumption, and I'm interested in discussing energy solutions, energy sources that can supply all our energy consumption, not just a fraction. Then there are two other kinds of solar energy that I won't be discussing, because they cost a lot more than the silicon panels that I'm going to be talking about the price for. These other two are, instead of the sunlight coming and hitting a piece of silicon and somehow through some technological magic producing electricity, instead the sunlight comes in, it's collected to heat something up. That hot thing powers hot water, hot salt, whatever, powers some turbine, and the turbine makes electricity. So one way to do this is to build long sort of oval shaped mirrors that half of an oval or half of a circle, that and a pipe going down through the middle, uh, and these mirrors focus the heat onto a pipe. The pipe gets warm. There's water running through the pipe, and it runs down to 100 meters or whatever. It runs down to some collection point, and then drives some turbine. Another one, which you probably have seen in sci-fi movies or action flicks, and there aren't very many of these things around the world, and they don't make money, is something where you have a high tower, um, and you have thousands and thousands of mirrors on the ground focusing on that tower, sending sunlight to that tower, to the top of the tower, and then the top gets hot and powers a turbine. Both of these options involving heat just are too expensive. They cost several times more. The electricity coming from them costs several times more than the electricity that we produce with silicon. And the reason is that they have to cover the same land area that silicon does, so a lot large expanses of land, and also they're just involve more machinery. So it's the extra machinery that makes them more expensive than silicon. So I'm not going to go any further with those. I'm just talking about silicon solar cells. They're the cheapest one, and we'll find that it's still too expensive to supply all our energy. Now the next thing about what I'm talking about is I have to talk about the quantity of solar cells that are required to supply 46,000 calories per person per day. And and of course that the quantity of solar cells, if you have to use twice as many solar cells, then it will cost twice as much. So I need to lay out how many solar cells you need to supply 46,000 calories. And this varies a lot depending on where you are in the world. If you haven't, let's talk about an average energy consumption. A town of 10,000 people using 46,000 calories, and let's say that this town is not too far north, not too far south, not above the 45th parallel. So almost all humans live below the 45th parallel because it's warmer and there's more sun there. And this town is not in a desert and not in the mountains. Okay, so it's a habitable area where most of us live. And a town like this will require, of 10,000 people using the average amount of energy, 46,000 calories, will need 9/10 of a square kilometer, almost a whole square kilometer of solar cells in order to supply their 46,000 calories. That changes a bit depending where you are. It can be as low as 0.65 square kilometers and as high as 1.3 square kilometers. Let's convert that to acres. A square kilometer is 250 acres. So, or it's something like 2/5 of a square mile. So we're talking about an awful lot of acres for hundreds of acres for an average town of 10,000. In deserts, it can be a little bit less. It could be 0.55 square kilometers, which is a little bit lower than the range that's normal in the rest of the world. The normal range is generally from 0.65 to 1.3 square kilometers. So it's a little bit less, but it's not far off from the usual. Now, in the rich half of the world, remember the rich half, I've divided up the world into a poor half and a rich half, and the poor half is Africa and all of Asia except for China, South Korea, Japan, and Australia. So I admit that this isn't exact. There are some hot spots of richness in this part of the world, like Singapore, um, but it's a convenient way, and it's also this poor half of the world uh, uh, is a little bit more than half of the world's population, not much more than half, but it's a convenient way of dividing. And then the rich half of the world is everything else. It's China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, North and South America, Europe. Um, anyway, the rich half uses a lot more energy. It uses twice the world average. So these countries need twice as much land for a town of 10,000. They need 1.8 square kilometers, um, almost 2. Now the United States uses even more. So in most of the United States would require 4.5 square kilometers in order to, of solar cells in order to supply enough energy uh, for to meet 10,000 people's consumption. Um, you know, you can think that means it's 2 kilometers on a side, or even for an average town, it's 1 kilometer on a side. It'll take you 10 minutes at least to walk from one end to the other. Um, Now, in the United States does have a desert in the southwest, a rather large desert, and in that part of the United States, you wouldn't need 4.5 square kilometers. You would need only 3.2 square kilometers to supply a town of 10,000. Now, this is the amount of solar cells, and you should already be thinking these are enormous quantities of solar cells. Um, Dwarfing our cities, our towns, and everything else that we've built. They're not high, but they're wide and long. But actually, our solar farms will require far more land than that. 3 times, 6 times more land. Okay, and let me tell you why. Um, the sun, unless you're on the equator, the sun does not go directly over your head. Instead, if you're north of the equator, the sun tends to stay south of, tends to stay to the south of being directly over your head, and in the north it tends to stay, and if you're in the southern hemisphere, the sun tends to stay toward the north. And if you want to make the best use of your solar cells, you'll put them at an angle that's directly facing the sun. Now, ideally, if you wanted to get the absolute most from your solar cells, you'd have your panels moving all through the day and all through the year to keep themselves always facing directly the sun. But that's rather expensive, so we don't do it. Instead, the cheapest option is just to put them at an angle and have them at that set angle all the time. But since they're at an angle, they can get it in each other's way. In other words, your solar cells are at an angle relative to the ground, so they're not flat on the ground. They have some up and down to them, and so when the sun is not at, in fact, it's never at the top. It's never directly at your head, above your head. It will be coming down at an angle in it, and therefore your solar cells can cast a shadow on each other. And you don't want this shadowing, because then you lose money. You lose electricity and energy. So people who build solar parks never build their solar panels right next to each other. They always space them apart to reduce the amount of shadowing. They never completely succeed in eliminating the shadowing, which we'll come back to later. And the shadowing is worse in the winter than in the summer. But they want to try to reduce the amount of shadowing, so they space them apart. So at latitudes lower than 24 degrees, in other words, fairly close to the equator, you make a solar park that is 3 times, its area will be 3 times larger than the amount of solar panels that you need. In other words, out of each square meter of solar park, only 1/3 of it will actually be covered with solar panels. Then at higher latitudes between 24 and 51 degrees, that includes the United States, China, Japan, Southern Europe, India, and Northern Africa. So much of the world is at these higher latitudes. There you'll space your solar panels apart so that your solar park, its area will be 4.5 times the area of your solar panels. So, and then if you're in Northern Europe, which is even further to the north, it's above 51 degrees, then you'll build your solar park so its area is 6 times the area of your solar panels. So we're not just talking about enormous quantities of solar panels that would be required to supply our energy consumption. We're also talking about even larger amounts of land. And that's a really crucial thing to keep track of for the cost of solar energy. So how much land? In the United States, an average town of 10,000 would need 4.5 square kilometers of solar panels on a solar park that's 20 square kilometers. So 20 square kilometers, that's 4.5 kilometers on a side for our town of 10,000. 4.5 kilometers would be around 3 miles. It's a lot bigger than the town. It's huge. In Northern Europe, Europe on average uses some countries use more, some use less, but maybe half of the energy consumption of the United States per person. So your town of 10,000 would be using half as much energy, but it's higher, closer to the North Pole, so it's getting less electricity from its solar panels, and also you have to be more cautious about the shadowing, so you'll use a lot bigger solar park, and in the end, even though you're using half as much energy, your 10,000 people will still need 20 square kilometers to supply their electricity. Now let me be clear about these solar parks. It's not like you have some solar panels and then you can use that land for whatever else you like. So in fact, there's been a big drive to put solar panels on our houses and our buildings and our cities and so on. Well, that's well and good. I have nothing against it, really. Well, except that sooner or later those solar panels will stop working and decay, and then they'll leak toxic chemicals on your family's roof. But unless you take it away and dispose it somewhere, who knows where. Okay. Aside from that, little detail, I have nothing against building solar panels in cities and towns. It's sensible, but there's just not enough area on offer here. There's not, towns are not, a town of 10,000 is not 4.5 kilometers on a side, and then even if it were, there's very little of that. A small fraction of that would actually be available for the solar panels. You would, because a lot of your town is lawns and streets and things. There's also problems like as I said, you want to have your solar panels at an angle facing the sun, and typically if you mount your solar panels on your roof, you have them at the angle of your roof, not at the right angle for facing the sun. Another problem is that solar panels are at their cheapest when you build them on large solar parks, and they cost between 2 and 4 times more if you build them on a family's roof. So anyway, I'm just saying that you can build them in towns, but this is not going to supply our 46,000 calories. Okay, you need much larger amounts of land, and this is dedicated land, because the overriding priority for the land is that the solar panels function and they supply electricity steadily, and nothing else can get in the way of that. Now, solar panels have to occupy an awful lot of land, and that means we have to make them cheap and pretty flimsy. And they have to last for 25 or 30 years in order to make a return on our investments. So and also in order to save money, we put them as close to the surface of the earth as we can. Typically, they don't even reach 2 meters high, except for the highest point, and they may be at an angle and going all the way down to practically ground level, or come knee level or whatever. And so they're fairly flimsy. They're low to the ground, and you can't run livestock past them, because the livestock, at least you have to be very careful about it, because the livestock can run into the solar panels and cause and damage them in one way or another. If you try to farm on the land around the solar panels, then you have to go to lots of extra effort to farm around the solar panels. You can't just drive your tractor straight through your field and come back. You have to do lots of tricks around them. And if you should happen to run into your solar panel with your tractor, then you're in trouble again. So you have to be extremely careful, and you have to be very restrictive about the activities that you let happen on that land, in order for your solar panels to not be destroyed sooner or later. Or you have to go to extra expense, maybe mount them higher, maybe mount them above 2 meters high so that people can walk underneath them and your livestock, and then also make the supporting structures stronger so that a cow or a sheep can collide with it, and nothing will happen. That costs a lot more money. So there have been efforts, and there continue to be efforts to research and to build shared farming and solar parks together, and they are funded by governments that want to promote solar, and so far, the overriding priority is getting the solar energy from them. So far, there's no clear signal that they can make money. It's not clear that you can make, considering the extra expense and the care that you need to put into your land in order to allow any sort of farming or something around these panels. It's unclear whether you can make any return on the extra effort. And I forgot to mention, there's also problems that the solar panels will cause uneven amounts of water, different strange erosion patterns, humidity, and temperature changes that will affect your crops. And it won't be like having one big field where all of your corn has grown under the same conditions, and so you can expect pretty much the same thing from all of your crop across that field. Instead, you have something very minute happening, changing from meter to meter, and it gets very complicated very quickly. So as far as I can understand, the reports coming from these research projects, I'm not sure that they're actually research projects. They seem to me more like propaganda efforts, saying yes, we can do solar um, and still farm. These reports are very ambiguous about how this could ever make money, and they're also written in very technocratic language. They don't seem like anything that would appeal to a farmer or even have any consideration for a farmer. So it looks to me like once government funding stops coming for these things, I mean, the only way that these things operate is by having additional government funding. They can't make a profit without the government funding. Once the government funding ceases, then what will happen is, since this land is already dominated by technocrats and not by real farmers, that land will just be taken over by technocrats and will be devoted entirely to solar, or to whatever the technocrats happen to want to do. Um, so what I'm saying here is that the whole solar park is dedicated. There's no reasonable way to make a profit on carrying on some other activity along with the solar. And I should have mentioned this with wind. Wind involves building wind turbines, huge machinery every square kilometer or so apart, and having access roads and huge machinery coming and going, and the sound. Anyway, and when solar involves dedicating huge amounts of land and covering it and restricting what grows there so that it doesn't even get to the height of the solar panels. Overall, green energy is not really green. It's an alternative to the biosphere. You can't really let the biosphere do its thing in any sense. You have to really dominate it in order to have green energy. It's not something that actually coexists with the biosphere. It's an alternative to a biosphere. Okay, well, that's it for talking about it being dedicated land. Let's talk a little bit about how much land that is. I said it's 20 square kilometers in the United States or Europe for 10,000 people. How does that compare to how much land there is on offer? Well, as I've mentioned before, for each person and each of us living on planet Earth today, there's about 16,700 square meters. So if we divided it equally, and that means that if you had a town of 10,000 people, those 10,000 people would have 167 square kilometers between them. 167 square kilometers, of which, if those 10,000 people were living in Northern Europe or in the United States, they'd be dedicating 20 square kilometers. So in the United States and Northern Europe, in order to supply all of your energy consumption, you would need to dedicate 1/8 of your land to solar parks. 1/8 of your land, if you have the average amount of land. Now, the United States has a lot of land. Northern Europe doesn't, which we'll come to shortly. What I'm trying to get at is that if we wanted to, suppose we wanted to multiply the world's energy consumption by 5, which would put the entire world's energy consumption where the United States is now. Okay, right now the United States uses almost 5 times more than the world average. Suppose we wanted to multiply the world's energy consumption by 5, then we would have to dedicate 1/8 of the world's land to solar parks. That's if we could afford to do it, which we'll find we can't. Okay, but 1/8 of the world's land would multiply our energy consumption by 5. That would allow us to do 2 more doublings of our energy consumption, which would take us about another 50 years. Okay. If we wanted to do 1 more doubling, okay, so 3 more doublings compared to today, then we would want to dedicate 1/4 of the world's land to solar parks. So what I'm trying to tell you is that even though solar does give you more energy than wind does, we're still not too far from our limit. Once we dedicate 1/4 of the world's land to solar, then, well, around 1/4 of the world's land is things like deserts or barren areas or sparsely vegetated areas. After we dedicate 1/4, then we'd start using other areas that have plenty of green things living on them, and that land is pretty much all spoken for. We need and we use the rest of that land for our farms and for our forests, for our pastures, and so on. The amount of land that we reserve for parks or just simply aren't using is rather limited, and it certainly isn't going to supply that much. So I think the most we could do with solar is, even if we turned 1/4 of the world's land into solar parks, is we could multiply our energy consumption by 10. That would be 3 more doublings. So it's a lot of land. Now, with all that said, and you have a good idea, hopefully by now, of what we're talking about, what these solar parks are like, and how much land there will be, and so on. Let's talk about how much it would cost to build enough to supply 46,000 calories per day. And I'm going to include enough batteries to last 12 hours. So that'll be added on to the prices that I give you. So if we built enough in our deserts, the price of 46,000 calories would be $7,500 to $9,000 per person. And there are certain deserts that get a little more sunlight, the Sahara, the Horn of Africa, the Namib Desert, the Atacama Desert in Peru, where you could get down to $7,000 per person to supply those 46,000 calories. But most deserts are somewhere between 7,500 and 9,000. So next, suppose we stay away from the deserts, but we keep ourselves near the equator. The equator gets some more sun. Then in these areas near the equator, and I'll tell you what they are, you'd pay between $8,500 and $11,000 per person. So we're talking about most of Africa, we're talking about the Middle East, we're talking about India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Southeast Asia. In these places you'd spend somewhere around $10,000 per person. And we're also talking about some richer countries that would actually want more than 46,000 calories. We're talking about South America, Central America, Mexico, and Australia would want, if they were going to build only 46,000 calories, they'd spend around $10,000. But they actually will want more. Now let's go further away from the equator and talk about the price of 46,000 calories away from the tropics. These are all richer countries. United States, China, Japan, Southern Europe. These countries would spend between $10,000 and $15,000 per person for 46,000 calories. And finally, you go up to Northern Europe, and places like Germany and England and Russia. And these places will spend between 15,000 and 18,000 calories for $15,000 and $18,000. Okay, so just to repeat, in the deserts you'll spend somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000. Near the equator, you'll spend somewhere between 8,500 and 11,000. away from the equator and the richer countries that are a bit further north, you'll spend between 10,500 and 14,500, and in Northern Europe, you'll spend 15,500 to 18,000 and up. Okay. Now, what about the fact that let's talk about how much it would cost to supply 94,000 calories per person for the rich half of the world. In China, Japan, and Southern Europe, it would cost 34,000 to supply their average energy consumption. And in London and Moscow and in Northern Europe, it would cost 45,000. Now, this is all plus batteries, okay? And then in the United States, except in the desert, in the southwestern desert, you'd be spending between 66,000 and 85,000 per person. And in the desert, it would be 57,000. Now, I want to point out that these are per person prices. The price for a family comes out to be roughly the same as a house. They're not so different from the prices of wind. We'll compare a little bit more to wind in a minute. But if you tell an average person worldwide that they have to spend 10,000 for their solar panels plus another 4,000 for their batteries, coming out to 14,000, they'll say, well, they may wish they could spend that money, but we don't have that amount of money to spend on average worldwide. Perhaps 4,000 per person would be a better guess, as I argued in the previous episode. That's how much we spend on buying cars for ourselves. We have one car for every 5 persons worldwide. Or in the United States, if you told a family that they needed to spend, 80,000 for their solar panels and another 20,000 for their batteries, coming to 100,000 per person, and then you have a family of 4, so $400,000 to supply their solar panels and so on. Well, that family of 4 probably has enough money to buy, well, on average, close to 4 cars. These cars are not SUVs, they're not luxury, so maybe they have enough money to spend 80,000 or 100,000. They don't have enough to buy all those solar panels. Those solar panels and their batteries cost the same as a fairly expensive house, and they already have one, hopefully. If they can't afford to have a house, they probably can't afford to have 2, and many families today can't afford to have even 1. So we're never going to spend the amount of money required, because it's, whether you're in a poor country or in a rich country, the amount of money required is similar to that of buying a second house, and almost only a small fraction of us have that amount of money free. If you want to hear more about my arguments in that direction, I'd suggest you go back to the previous episode about wind. So how much would we be willing to spend, and how much would we be willing to harvest? Well, my guess is that on average worldwide we could spend $4,000 per person on solar, or on some combination of solar and wind and nuclear. Maybe 3,000 of that would be for the solar panels and 1,000 for batteries. And then in the United States, we might spend 20,000 per person. What could $3,000 spent on solar panels give you? In the deserts, it could give you 17,000 calories per day. In the tropics, it could give you 14,000 calories per day per person. So 14,000. And remember that the tropics have very poor winds, so you can't make money on wind turbines in the tropics. They're very expensive. The most effective strategy is just not to build wind turbines in the tropics and build them elsewhere. So what you could do is build your wind turbines towards the north or towards the south and just build solar panels in the tropics. You'd get 14,000 calories per person that way for your $4,000. Now in China and Japan and the United States and Southern Europe, you'd get 11,000 calories per person per day from your $4,000. And that's a bit less than wind would give you. Wind would give you on average 16,000 calories per person per day. So it's a bit less, but probably depending on where you are and the local circumstances, you might build some wind and some solar, I'm guessing. But in Northern Europe, you're not going to build any solar. There you get 8,000 calories per person per day. And there are other problems from your $4,000. And so you get half what you would from wind. Now, nowadays people are building solar in Northern Europe. Why can they do that? They can do it because right now they're getting most of their energy from other places, and the solar is icing on top. So it's priced because you have this interesting pricing structure where they have their base load supplied. They have a steady source of energy coming from other sources like coal, oil, and gas, or even nuclear. Therefore, the solar energy is icing on top, and you use it when you use that energy when it's available, and you don't when it's not. And therefore, the pricing all works out differently, and that's why they can think they're making a profit on solar. But if you were trying to rely all on solar or on solar wind and wind, you wouldn't find that you in Northern Europe you'd just decide, okay, well we'll build only wind. And then the amount of calories and the cost, of course, would be twice as much in the rich half of the world and four or five times more in the United States. So overall, you look at these figures in the tropics, where it's where we would build most of our solar panels. You get 14,000 out of the 46,000 calorie average, and in China and Japan, United States and Southern Europe, you get 11,000, which would be a quarter of our average consumption. And then in north of that, you just wouldn't build anything. So overall, I think we're likely to spend somewhere to get about even if we spent all the money we had just on solar, we'd get only a third or a quarter of our total energy consumption today from solar. So let me tell you a little bit about where I got these prices. You might be curious about that, of course. First, I want to say these prices are they're for everything except for the maintenance and the disposal of your solar panels. They're for getting the land, leasing it, whatever, for constructing everything around the solar park and then installing the panels themselves and everything else. I also have been talking about 12 hours of energy storage. I'm talking about large solar parks because residences, for instance, cost 2 to 4 times more to build solar panels there. In residences, and small solar parks are also high priced, not as much as the residences. Again, I'm not talking about something called the levelized cost of energy, which is most newspaper articles and magazine articles today about the cost of different sources of energy base those costs on some sort of prophecies about how much energy you'll produce over the next 30 years till your solar panels wear out, and how much that's likely to be paid, how much people will be willing to pay for that energy. And I don't want to think about prophecies and so on in the future. I just want to talk about how much it costs to build them in the first place. So partly because if we were to rely mostly on solar or wind, the pricing would all come out much differently than it does now when we rely mostly on coal, oil, and gas. Now, what determines the price of solar? It's the fact that it has to spread over an enormous area, because you have to build something that covers an enormous area. In order to do it at any reasonable price, you have to make these solar panels pretty flimsy and cheap, and then they also have to last 25 to 30 years. So you have to get somehow you have to combine extraordinary resilience and extraordinary economy. It's really hard to do, and in fact, building solar panels is in some sense harder. They're cousins of computer chips. They use the same sort of high-tech technology based on silicon and interesting things you can do with silicon, computer chips and solar panels. But we sort of had computer chips nailed down 50 years ago, and have just been making them smaller and smaller and smaller and faster and faster and faster. With solar panels, we've been continuing to come up with new ideas and struggling to get them to be reasonably priced for a very long time. And just now they're starting to be somewhat reasonably priced so they can compete with wind. And high-tech things are typically delicate, but you need this actually to be resilient and last for 25 or 30 years in the field. About 1/7 of the price of a solar farm, the solar park, goes into the solar panels themselves. About 6/7 goes into the supporting structures, the things that hold up the solar panels, the inverters, which convert the electricity produced by the solar panel into the kind of electricity that you'll actually use in your house, and the wiring and the foundations and so on. So 6/7 of that goes in, and these are things that are not new technology, and that require energy to produce, say the steel and the concrete and all the rest. So even if we could make the solar panels, the silicon, for free, it's already 1/600th of the price that it used to be. So if we could make them cheaper and cheaper until they're priced at zero, the total cost of our solar park would change by 15%. So technological improvements are not going to make a big difference, and in fact nothing will make a big difference in the cost of solar panels today. And moreover, when energy becomes more expensive, when coal, oil, and gas become harder to get, the price of all these, the foundations, the supporting structures, the wiring, and everything else will go up, because all of those things need energy to produce, and therefore if energy costs more, your wiring will cost more, your concrete will cost more, your steel will cost more, and your solar park will cost more. A hard thing here is that the price of solar varies a bit from country to country. It's 1.6 to 1.8 times more in some countries than it is in others. So the more expensive countries would be United States, South Korea, South Africa, and Russia, for example. Those all cost 1.6 to 1.8 times more than the cheaper countries, which are Spain, China, India, Brazil, and Germany. And I use the lower price as if it were sure that sooner or later the whole world's pricing will come down to the cheap prices today. This may not be correct. For instance, for an example of why you might not think it's correct, in 2023, China had invested in factories to build solar panels, and it made the majority of the world's solar panels. But in 2023, and it was expecting the world to buy a lot of solar panels, but in 2023 the world didn't buy that many solar panels, so China decided to buy them itself. So China bought 2/3 of the world's solar panels. It produced them and it bought them. And it did it at a very cheap price. And you have to wonder whether in the circumstance where China is just subsidizing itself to prevent itself going out of business and trying to keep its solar industry going, whether this is the real price of solar or whether it's a fluke. It's something that happened because China invested big in solar and then wants to come out ahead somehow. And so I don't know, maybe the price of solar has been coming down in the past, but it's hard to be sure that the current price is what it's going to. The lower prices today are the ones that are going to stick, or whether the price will go back up or anything like that. I want to talk about things that I'm leaving out of my pricing. I leave out the price of harsh environments, remote areas, in situations where you need to buy long power lines. I leave out, so that would add to the price. I leave out solar tracking. Most of the large wind farms today do do some changing in the angle of the solar panels as the day goes on. And that can increase a 25% efficiency solar panel to 29%. So it's a 4% increase beyond 25. So that would actually decrease the price of solar. But there are some other things that I'm leaving out that will increase it. One is aging. So aging, as the solar panels get older, they become less and less efficient. So you can decrease from 25% efficiency to 18%. I also leave out haze and dust and dirt cover the solar panels, breakdowns, downtime, high temperatures. They don't function well at high temperatures. Also, often solar parks are made with electronics that deliberately don't harvest all the energy when the sun is at its zenith. So there's a cap on the amount of energy you can get from the solar park because of electronics, not because of the solar panels. And all of these things could decrease the efficiency of, even if the solar park's built with 25% efficiency, even if it had 25% efficiency, even if it was capturing 25, by the way, 25%, I mean capturing 25% of the light over the day. I was using the wrong. We'll come to efficiency in a little while, but I don't mean, I shouldn't have been using the word efficiency. I meant the amount of the sunlight that is captured during the day. Let's see, I should explain this better. Even that's not quite the right explanation. I'm talking about comparing the actual 25%, 29%, 18% that I'm talking about is comparing the amount of electricity that the solar panel produces compared to what if if the solar panel were receiving sunlight all day long and all night long. It's a fraction. So if you, in other words, you put a solar panel, you build a new solar panel at your factory, you put it under a light source, you see how much energy it's getting from that light source in the factory, then you compare it to how much it gets on average in the field, and if it gets 1/4 of the average, if it's average in the field, it's 1/4 of what it gets in a standard light source in a standard factory, then you say it's efficient, it's producing at 25%. So I'm sorry, I confused things over the last few minutes by saying efficiency. I really meant comparing the field conditions to what you would get in a factory. So I'm leaving out solar tracking, which would increase that percentage from 25 to 29. I'm leaving out aging, which would decrease it to 18%. I'm leaving out all the dirt and high temperatures and electronics, which can reduce it even to 15%. And overall, if you take all these things together, probably my price of solar is too low, because I'm assuming that your solar panels that you're building are getting something more like what they would get in a factory than they actually do. Now we'll talk about efficiency, how that goes in. Efficiency means it's a different number. It has to do with, compared to the amount of sunlight that the solar panel receives, how much of that is actually turned into electricity. And right now solar panels have 20% efficiencies, the cheap one, I mean the ones that we can afford do. For special purposes you can get higher efficiency. And it's likely that in 10 years the efficiencies will go up to 24%, which would mean that since it goes up from 20 to 24%, that would mean that the price would get 20% cheaper. But this is the limit, okay? We'll never get more than 24% efficiency from our solar cells because they're made out of silicon. And the best you could ever get, even with perfectly functioning silicon solar cells that will never exist, just in somebody's textbook, would be 29%. Then you want to build them with real ones, and you want to do it at an affordable price. You'll never get 29%. The best you'll ever get is 24%. So as long as we stick with silicon, we'll never get much of a change in price from our solar cells. There may be a 20% improvement, but that's it. And there are reasons why we're locked into silicon. One of them the reason why we did get locked into silicon was because we were busy building silicon computer chips. And so it was very economical to develop our solar cells from the same material and using similar techniques. And then it took us 50 years of investment, where the solar, even though we were building from silicon, they were still very, very expensive. And if we wanted to try some other material, some other fundamentally new design, we'd have decades of very high prices and low efficiencies, and probably they would not last 25 years. And so do you want to jump? You're on a horse that can take you somewhere. Do you want to jump off your horse and wait for another one to show up? It's just very expensive, and we're not going to do it. As for the amount of sunlight that's coming to the world's land, which is part of determining the price of solar, I get all that from a website called Global Solar Atlas.info that tells you how much solar day by day, month by month you get through the year, practically anywhere in the world's habitable areas. It gives you very detailed resolution, individual neighborhoods of individual towns. It's great. So I hope that gives you at least the beginnings of an idea of where I got these numbers. think there's plenty of backing for them. If you want more, well, it'll all be in the book. Or you can look up the numbers yourself. It's not hard. It just takes time. In addition to the issues of cost, I want to talk about a few problems with solar. One is that as I've said, it's high tech, and high tech is hard to do. You need these very big supply chains that stretch around the world, very special equipment, very special factories, and in some sense, the solar is harder than computer chips because you need to make it enduring and covering a large area. And all of this is vulnerable. It's not just hard to do, it's also vulnerable to times of rapid change or to wars, which may disrupt the very delicate supply chains and so on. So solar could conceivably, in a time of crisis or of change or of war, could go back 20 or 30 years, and then sunlight would cost 10 times more and have lower efficiencies. So that means that it wouldn't just cost more for your solar panels, but they would give you less electricity. That's different from wind. Wind is pretty low tech. Another something I didn't emphasize enough was that it's not just that you have overcast times and nighttime to adjust to handle with solar. You also have seasons, and the amount of energy coming in from the sun changes seasonally. In the United States, typically the summer is roughly 1.2 to 1.45 times more energy in the summer than in the winter. But this is worsened by the fact that there's shadowing during the winter. Even if you space your solar panels apart, they still shadow themselves. And so even though you have somewhere between 1.2 and 1.45 change in the amount of sunlight coming in, the actual amount of solar energy generated in the United States is twice as much in summer as it is in winter. And that's the reason why it's worse, why the factor of 2 is worse than that, is because of shadowing, probably mostly. And it's much worse in northern Europe and at higher latitudes. In northern Europe, it can be the amount of sunlight coming in winter. It can be 1/5 of the amount during the summer, depending on where you are. The factor is between 3.5 and 5. And then because of shadowing, it's even worse. In Germany's solar parks get 10 times as much sunlight in summer as in winter. And in Moscow, if they did build solar parks, it would be even worse, because Moscow gets 10 times more sunlight in summer than in winter. So with shadowing, it would be an even worse factor, maybe 30 times. So overall, if you want to build enough solar panels to supply your energy during the winter, you're going to build more solar panels than you would need if you just were building based on your average. And what I'm saying is in northern Europe and even in some other places, the problem's so bad that the seasonal effect is so bad that you may reconsider whether to build them at all. And certainly in northern Europe, you're not going to build them if you want to make money. So you can also have weather, because of weather, like monsoons. Mumbai and the Sichuan province of China and Seattle in the United States, they have twice as much sunlight in the clear seasons as they do in the monsoon season. I should have mentioned some advantages, and I'll come back to some more disadvantages. One of, uh, uh, just to remind you, there's no huge machinery. This is customizable. These are small. You can make them small. You need, in order to get the amounts that we want, you need very large land areas. But you can, if you are willing to do with less, then you can do it very small. So it does have some advantages, but there are disadvantages, which I'll come back to one more, which is, again, the land requirement. The land requirement is so bad that the world's rich countries will have to move electricity over very large distances. So for England to supply all of its energy from solar, it would have to cover 1/2 of its land area with solar panels. Germany would need to cover 1/3 of its land area, and the Netherlands and Belgium would have to cover the entire land area with solar panels, solar parks. Well, they're not going to do that, of course. And they're not going to get that their energy from solar energy from nearby neighbors. Italy and France, for instance, they'd have to cover between 1/6 and 1/9 of their land area with solar parks, which is already a lot, and they aren't going to be willing to share to take even more land to supply England and Germany. So Europe would have to get its electricity from far away, from Turkey or the Middle East or the Sahara. And in general, you don't want to do long distance transport of energy, either from wind or from solar, unless you have a rock solid agreement and commitment from both parties, the supplier and the consumer, that they can rely on each other for decades, and that would justify the investment, the contracts. And you need to have some way of protecting all the infrastructure, all the wires and stuff in between, so that nobody's going to bomb it or whatever. So it's very expensive, and it's also very risky to build arrangements where electricity has been being moved across continents. And basically, I think you need hegemony. You need some overseeing power that supplies the security, and basically an empire sort of thing that guarantees that the relationship between the consumer and the supplier. And there aren't that many places where you find that sort of thing nowadays. India would be an example. India has some interior deserts, and so it could guarantee, as long as it remains a single whole, it can guarantee a working relationship between solar parks in the interior and consumers on the coasts. Another example is China. China is a very large land area, and part of that is a desert. And the United States, which has a very large land area and has a desert. So there it would work. But for Europe, Europe doesn't have that sort of, well, it's trying to attempt, the European Union is trying to attempt to build that sort of hegemony over Europe, but it doesn't include the faraway areas like Turkey and the Middle East and Sahara. So at this time, there's not that sort of cohesion required that would be required. Now let's go to Asia. To provide all of its energy, South Korea would have to use 4/5 of its land area. Japan would have to provide 1/3 of its land area for solar parks, which neither of them are going to do. China has a very densely populated region stretching from the Shanghai-Hangzhou region in the south up towards Beijing, and 500 million people in that area. And those 500 million people, if they were to build solar parks in this big region for themselves, they would have to dedicate 1/3 of their land area to solar parks, which they're not going to do. So what about these 500 million people? Where would they get their solar energy from if they were going to rely only on solar? Well, they're not going to get it from neighboring parts of China, because this very densely populated part that I talked about between Beijing and Shanghai, Beijing in the north, Shanghai in the south, is bordered by, to its west, a much larger area stretching from China's border on the Pacific with Russia all the way down to Myanmar in the southwest. It's an immense area, and 94% of China's population lives in this larger area, and this area, so this is including also the more densely part that I talked about earlier. They would have to dedicate 1/5 of their land area to solar, which they're not likely to do, and even if they do, they aren't going to build extra for the more densely populated part. So, so this electricity will need to come from even further away, from places far to the west of China, thousands of kilometers away, or from Tibet, or from Tibet has good sun, or from Southeast Asia. So again, now China has hegemony, so maybe it can do this sort of thing if it wants to. And in the United States, it's a similar story. Many of the states on the eastern coast would have to dedicate half or more of their land area to solar. And they aren't going to import it from areas to the east of the Mississippi, because that's prime farmland, or else mountains. So they'll have to get it from far in the west of the United States, like the southwestern desert. So in all of these cases, if the rich countries of the world want to get their energy from solar, they're going to have to move it very large distances across continents. And in some cases, and in general, that will require some sort of hegemony in it. So if you have it, then great, you can go ahead. Even then, it would be extremely expensive to build all this infrastructure, expenses that I haven't included in the pricing. But if you don't have hegemony, you're almost certainly not going to do it. Lastly, I want to talk about deserts, just to nail that one down. We often hear about how deserts have so much sunlight, and we could provide so much of the world's energy just from a relatively small parcel of desert. Say like a quarter of the Sahara might produce all the world's energy. Well, first of all, that's probably, those estimates come from just producing all of the world's electricity. Also, probably those estimates come from forgetting that solar parks are 4 or 5 times bigger than the number of solar panels. So anyway, those estimates of the parcels of land are way off, because you have to build the solar park several times bigger. And also you have to supply all of the world's energy, not just electricity, if you want to do it without coal, oil, and gas. And then of course you have to transport the energy over very long distances from wherever the desert is to somewhere else. I want to point out, I think first of all, deserts don't really give you that much more sunlight. They only give you 30 or 40% more sunlight than, so 1.3 or 1.4 times as much sunlight as you get on average in other areas. The main motivation for using a desert is just that it's unoccupied. Against that one or two advantages, there are many disadvantages of deserts. First of all, it's very difficult for solar cells to hold up for 25 or 30 years of normal weather and normal conditions, and it's another level of intensity in a desert. It's much, much harder. It's a different ball game trying to get solar to hold up in a desert. And you might know that solar panels are easily damaged by heat, and heat is one thing that deserts have a lot of. There's also the winds are much stronger in the desert because there are no trees in the way, and so they do more damage. There's also dust and sand that cover the solar panels, and that will foul anything that moves. It'll get in the joints and the gears and so on, and the electronics, just everywhere, and it'll be a continual problem. And there's a shortage of water, of course, in a desert, and you'll want the water in order to clean off your solar panels. The amount of solar panels that, as I've said many times, is just huge, and they're delicate and they're vulnerable. And so it doesn't one person or a few people who want to maraud and cause problems could do an enormous amount of damage. And you need to protect your solar panels. Protect them in a desert against not just the weather and so on, but against people. And the protection needs to be pretty good. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, a huge area, very difficult conditions for 25 or 30 years. And the last problem is you aren't going to have that much money to pay your workers, either the protectors or the workers on the land. Because, again, solar panels cost a lot just to build them, and you'll be struggling to make ends meet, trying to get enough money back on your investment, and you aren't going to have that much money to spare to pay your workers. Your workers will be in a high-risk environment. Deserts are considered risky for a reason. They're very dangerous places for humans. They'll be doing very difficult work, and they'll be receiving middling or poor wages, whoever they are. So you have to think of a solar park not as something like an oil gusher. It's more like a coal mine in terms of what people will get paid, and the difficulty and the danger of the work. It's not a get-rich-quick scheme. The sort of person there will be more like a farmer than like an office worker. They'll have tough skin. They'll have not endure difficult situations and do without. And there'll be something more like the real cowboys, the ones that lived on horses and ranged and managed cattle, not the movie stars, but the real ones. And they'll be less like engineers. Okay, there'll be people who are there partly because they're just that sort of person, not because they're there for the money. You wouldn't do this for the money. So deserts are not the solution. In fact, I can't think of any very good reason to build solar panels in a desert, except for desperation. So that's it for solar. Overall, solar has plenty of problems, and the biggest problem is the price and the fact that it turns a large fraction of the world into a factory floor, just like wind. Okay, well, the next 2 episodes will be about nuclear, and nuclear is a different ballgame, but it'll still come out to we aren't going to build that much. Okay, thanks for your attention, and keep coming back.